Okay, let's continue our look here at unit number 2, and this is Greco-Roman slavery, and it's a comparison between the Greco-Roman system of slavery and that system that India or China may have with slavery. It's a pretty easy way to think of this and remember it. The Greco-Roman world is built on slavery. The Indian Chinese world is not. Slavery there is at a minimum. Now, this is both beneficial and detrimental to the Greco-Roman world. They're able to create these great cities like Rome and Athens on the backs of the hard work of slaves. We've already mentioned that in Athens, Greece, there's for every one person, one citizen, one male citizen, there are 2 slaves doing the work that he's putting together. These slaves in the Roman Empire helped to build the Roman roads that you see there in the top left-hand picture. The statement, all roads led to Rome, is a pretty important one. As they were conquering places, they were building roads to get there and conquer them. But those same roads would carry some of their citizens back to be representatives in Senate and to continue the idea of Roman government and the Republic. But as it becomes an empire, and there are so many slaves, the Roman Empire, you could make a case for the fact that this Greco-Roman world collapses because of the lack of innovation and initiative that people put into place. Instead of being somewhat creative and coming up with new ways of solving your issues and your problems, you just throw a great number of slaves at the problem instead. So let's look through this. Here's Hadrian's Wall, which is a great example, built by legionnaires, and much of the labor on Greek temples was undertaken by free, skilled artisans. But Rome has a large number of state-owned slave laborers, that built things like the aqueducts and palaces and ports. The aqueducts are amazing. You've got these reservoirs in the mountains and the Alps, and you've got a system of plumbing that's continuously bringing delivery of fresh, clean drinking water to the cities, especially to Rome. And it does so in a way that's completely built on gravity and the water coming downhill. Modern aqueducts, like the one we have nearby, Lake Houston's an aqueduct, basically a man-made lake off of the San Jacinto River and its tributaries. It works more like the bottom image there, where you've got this conduit that comes from there, but it goes in different directions and it's kind of pumped to get to the treatment plant and then to the city. So what the Romans do without electricity is pretty remarkable. But why is slavery so much more prominent in the Greco-Roman world? Compare the lot of slave gangs working on latifundia or in mines to that of household slaves, because there are a tremendous amount of slaves who are now, as Rome becomes the strongest civilization and then empire of the Mediterranean world, the farmer that kind of created the Roman Empire is being displaced by slaves. These farmers are basically going to the Roman cities and Rome itself and looking for work to do. They're displaced, they have no employment opportunities. And that's very, very difficult for some of these people to deal with. Their lives are changing dramatically. They used to be landowners. This land has been passed down from generation to generation, and now very rich and wealthy senators and other businessmen are purchasing up their land and creating these massive farms out of that. Very similar to what happens and what's happened in America, the death really of these small American farmers. There just aren't very many of those anymore. So you have a tremendous amount of slave labor in the Roman Empire, but you also have a lot of slaves who are working for these wealthy people of means and money, that are what's called body slaves. These are the slaves who are working to do someone's hair and makeup and to clean their house and to do their food. This system of slavery is one that we would consider to be similar to that southern situation, Gone with the Wind, those types of movies where you may be familiar with the African American slaves that had to do the same kind of work in the homes. And then, of course, there were tremendous amount of American slavery that worked on plantations and also sugarcane plantations. But could slaves revolt from this? I mean, there were so many more slaves in a small area than there were slave owners or business owners or farmers, people who ran the farm. So Spartacus was someone who did revolt. And there's a couple different versions of his story. There's the movie Spartacus, which you can see there won 4 Academy Awards in its time, which is a little older movie. And then there's the newer version of Spartacus, which is kind of glossed up a little bit. That's been on the Starz network on the movie channels. But all of the slaves that a master had, if a slave killed the master, then all of the slaves of that master would be put to death. They couldn't be moved from one slave owner to another. So right there, that really cuts down on the people who are going to, in the Roman world, revolt against their master and kill the master. You are basically committing suicide and killing your entire family and everyone you know that you live with as a slave. So it's a pretty smart law on the Roman side, the Greco-Roman side, but it puts people in their place as slaves. So the modern conveniences that we have, we don't think it's necessary to have a domestic servant around who is a slave, but were they ever really necessary? Isn't this really just the weakness of power and patriarchy, of people who are saying, we're better than those we've conquered, therefore they can work for us and be slaves? And think about the amount of money that they're creating in an economy and not really giving anything back in terms of compensation to the workers. It's a tremendous economic boost to places that use slavery, and they're able to build great things with this slave labor. But as I talked about earlier, this is not going to help in the long run, because if you have an issue or a problem, the government or those people in charge just say throw a large number of slaves at them. The body slave, which a lot of students consider to be like, I don't know, some type of sexual slave, that's not what we're talking about here. Body slave is someone who would be in the home, who would work on bathing, showering, the makeup kind of thing, and the dress of their masters and their mistresses, the people that looked after them in the home. For all of the growing inequality and unrest in Rome, it just seemed to continue to grow like a boulder of snow coming down the mountain and just gaining in size. What you have here is a situation where power is switching from the many Romans to just a few, and the emperors are a good example of that. What used to be a senate of 300 devoted patrician or plebeian, patrician being of the richer class, plebeians being of the working class, where they're getting together in maybe these two bodies of law that are creating and ruling on Rome each day and thinking about the best ways to represent their people. This is not a direct democracy like they had in Greece. This is more representative form like we have today. However, you could make the case that in America today, we're having the same exact issues and problems. We have a group of congressmen who are so connected to their business interests and to the money generated by corporations that they're constantly in this mode of listening only to those businesses and corporations and not to the people that they represent. It's a pretty dramatic difference that we're seeing today in the government. Government's not being able to be innovative and solve some of the new issues that we're seeing happen, whether it's with the economy or a good example is the internet. I mean, they have just seemed like they have one hand tied behind their back when they're dealing with issues of the new technology that's out there today. Part of that is just the fact that you have so much money in politics. a very similar thing is happening, as I've mentioned. Wealthy, powerful families in the Senate and political offices are buying up all the land, running just a few farms, and having just a tremendous amount of political control. The bottom right-hand corner is a picture of the Roman Senate. And he's giving a speech. And he's looking, I think it's Cicero, he's looking over to the side, I guess it's to this side, and he is saying, as he's looking there and looking out in that side, he's trying to convince them of something. If I pull the picture back, you would see there's like one person sitting there. So just like today, we have Democrats and Republicans, they kind of sit on either side. That's why they call Republicans left and Democrats right, because it's where they sit when they're in the chamber debating things. And I don't have the picture completely pulled out, but if I did, I think it might be in another presentation, you can see a few empty seats, like right below here at the bottom, the brown seats. They're just wooden carved seats. It's that kind of a situation where power is shifted, and it seems like there's not much that's being done. The top left-hand corner is an image from the HBO miniseries. It's been gone for quite a long time, but I think it had 2 or 3 seasons, called Rome. And it was very, very well done in terms of costumes and sets and some accuracies as far as depicting life in Rome. And we're going to see a small clip or two from that this week in class as we talk about Rome. But the blood that's running in the streets as the Roman soldiers are now battling over control. And the emperors seem to end up having an army that does their work for them. It's might that makes right, and not great new ideas that makes right. And an emperor is more like a king than they ever wanted it to be from the original days of the Roman Republic. The bottom left-hand corner I want to mention is from the movie Gladiator, which is a tremendous movie. It won Best Picture in the year 2000. Russell Crowe in that movie, and it's really a good idea to watch for extra credit if you've never seen it. Slavery in the Classical Era, a historical investigation. Let's kind of check this out. So, why did slavery emerge in first civilizations just to begin with? Well, the domestication of animals provides a model for human slavery where humans can understand, well, these animals work for us. And it kind of puts a perception in early human civilization's mind that this is something that they could do to human beings as well. War, especially patriarchy and private property ideas, encourage slavery. And remember to pause these as you go through this. Pause this video as you go through this to write some of these down if you're missing any of them. Because I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but that's the magic of YouTube, is you can pause the video, write down what you need, and think through it. 3 women were captured in war and were probably some of the first slaves. So patriarchy there, you see the level of patriarchal or male ownership of women. And it may have encouraged slavery, this idea that women are man's possession. Today, that's something that most of my young women students would not stand for. I could guarantee that. Slavery in the Classical Era, a historical investigation, continues with slavery is social death. It's a lack of rights or independent personal identity. It's a long-established tradition, and even in the time of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, just quite a long time ago, almost all civilizations had some form of slavery. It varies over time and place. The classical Greek and Roman slaves did allow some emancipation, which means you could earn your freedom or be granted your freedom by your master. Julius Caesar, not pictured down at the bottom here, that's a wealthy patrician woman, and the other person sitting there on the seat is depicted as Mark Antony. That's in the HBO series called Rome. Now, in the back of them, standing there, is a slave. And at various points in that show, in the miniseries, like, for example, Julius Caesar, right before he's killed, he gives and grants his slave, his main slave, which had lots of power, actually, because he was the dictator's head slave who did lots of work for him. Julius Caesar granted, in the case of Julius Caesar himself dying, that his slave would become a free man. And in some ways, he had definitely earned that because he had to work pretty hard with him. The Aztec Empire, as we'll study down the road here, had children of slaves, and those children of slaves were considered to be free. That's very different than the concept of familiar or family ownership of slaves. The type of labor that slaves did varied, as we've talked about already. It could be a body slave who works inside the house. It could be someone who's working on a plantation for a farm like the latifundia in Rome. Or it could be a person who is doing some heavy labor. Slavery in the classical era, the case of China and India. Now, we have not talked China and India yet, other than to say that slavery was a lot less of an issue there. So how less of an issue was it? Well, less than 1% of the population, or around 1% of the population in China, were slaves. That's a tiny, tiny percentage. I would almost say today, in the world today, there's no way that percentage is that low. We have a problem with human trafficking in the world today. It's a very big issue. The numbers aren't massive, but because there's so many people in the world and so many people at risk, the percentages may not be super high, but I would think they'd be higher than 1% of the population of the world. But that's still a lot of people if you think about it. So convicts and their families were the earliest slaves. So prisoners, people who are convicted of crime. Poor peasants sometimes sold their children into slavery to earn money. That's pretty sad. In India, criminals, debtors, war captors, or captives could become slaves. Largely domestic slaves in India. Religion and law gave some protections to slaves, and society wasn't economically dependent on slavery in any way because there are just so few slaves. Now, I want to focus on the left-hand side there about filial piety, chastity, the role of women and men, and loyalty, courage, self-devotion, honor, reverence, truthfulness, or trustworthiness, intelligence, perseverance, and hard work. These ideas, these root values of Confucianism. That's, of course, China. The bottom, you also see the Chinese class system made up of the gentry, scholar gentries, the peasants, and then the merchants below that. I know we've talked about this in another video, but there's a very good and significant triangular shape of what at least the non-governmental officials would look like. Making of slave society the case of Rome. Mediterranean Western civilization, slavery plays an immense and enormous role. The Greco-Roman world was a slave society. About a third of the population of classical Athens was enslaved. Out of every 3 people, there were 2 slaves, at the minimum as far as citizens were concerned. But 1 of 3 of the entire classical Athens population was a slave. Aristotle backed this up by saying some people are just slaves by nature. This is just the nature and the natural world of slavery. It's the way people are. And this is a rational or person who's trying to reason the world in a very non-religious way and use its science and rational thought to do that. And he still comes up with the idea that slaves are just a part of nature. But in a way, you can kind of understand why. I mean, that's just what society had always had. But beginning of the Common Era, by the beginning of it, Italy's population, which is the home of the Roman Empire, was 33 to 40% slaves. That is a massive amount of slaves. The wealthy Romans owned hundreds or thousands of slaves. Remember, many of them working as latifundia or farms, as big, massive owned farms. People of modest means often worked 2 or owned 2 or 3 slaves themselves. You just didn't even have that much money, but you still had slaves. Massive enslavement of war prisoners, which there were plenty of those because the Roman Empire expanded through military might. Piracy, if you were caught as a pirate and you were stolen, or if people stole you as pirates, stole you from your population and they put you into slavery. Long distance trade for Black Sea, East African, and Northwestern European slaves. The natural reproduction of slaves produced more. The abandonment and exposed children, that would lead to those kids becoming slaves if they had nowhere else to go. How were they going to have food? There wasn't a situation set up in the government to care for orphans, and many of them would just become slaves. The slaves were not associated with a particular ethnic group, although many people would say that the word slave might originate and come from the Slavic world, which is that pocket between the Italian peninsula and Greece. And so you've got the Greek peninsula here and the Italian boot kind of kicking it here. In the middle of that, to the northern part, the more mountainous part, we know of it as Macedonia, that we studied earlier. That might be where a large number of slaves or Slavic people came from. I am not certain of that. I've read differing accounts on it, but that might be part of the reason why. There is some question, as we see later, why Africans are enslaved so much. Many people believe that there just aren't as many slaves available to be had, and then it's easier to get them from there because they're being sold into slavery by their own people in Africa. We'll get there much later down the road. There's little serious social critique of slavery, even in the Christian world, but that may be partially because the Bible talks about slavery pretty often. There are some different portions that mention it. I won't get into quoting the Bible here tonight, but if you've read it, you've probably seen some mention of slavery. Making the case for a slave society, we're looking at Rome still. Slavery was deeply entrenched. Slaves did all sorts of work except military service. And in fact, early on, you had to be a landowner to be a soldier. And if you weren't someone who was able to work the land in your own land, and you didn't own property, then you wouldn't even have anything to fight for under the old Roman Republic, and therefore you wouldn't be a soldier. Those ideas kind of continued. They didn't want slaves to be soldiers. That's very similar to Athens' Greek way of life. The Spartan way was anybody they could get to fight, including some slaves. So, these slaves did both highly prestigious and often degrading tasks. Slaves had no legal rights. They couldn't marry. If a slave murdered his master, like we mentioned, all the slaves were killed that the master had owned. Manumission was common, where Roman freedmen became citizens, which that's quite an elevated sense, to be born a slave or become a slave and then earn your own freedom and then maybe even be a citizen as well. Resistance and rebellion. Cases of mass suicide of war prisoners to avoid slavery, that happened. Weapons of the weak, theft, sabotage, poor work or curses. These are things that they would do to rebel. Flight, where they would run to hide, or occasional murder of owners and rebellion occurred. The most famous was led by Spartacus in 73 BCE. Nothing on a similar scale occurred until Haiti in the 1790s, and we'll see that when we study the Atlantic revolutions and the time period of the Haitian Revolution as well. It's pretty interesting how that spreads from the French Revolution across the ocean back into the Americas. Roman slave rebellions did not attempt to end slavery, but participants wanted to free themselves. And I wanted to talk about Spartacus here a little bit. The actual real Spartacus person in history did have this incredibly successful, for a while anyway, revolt against their masters. But it ended up being unsuccessful. Along the Appian Way, which is the major main road that led into Rome and out of Rome, they crucified every last slave that revolted. They put them up on crosses, and not only did they crucify them along the roadway as people were coming in and out of Rome to see and to witness this, but they lit them on fire at night and let that burn, being a very, very vivid reminder to any slave that if you revolt, it will not go well. But Spartacus was public enemy number one for quite a while, and depicted in the Stars series. It's a very adult content. I'm not sure that it's something that high school students might even find appealing, but it is really, it's really graphic in many ways, sexually violently. But the series kind of plays off the idea of Spartacus and the rebellion that you may have witnessed if you read some Strayer. He talked through it some. So that, in a nutshell, here is slavery. Much more prominent in the Greco-Roman world than in India or China. So don't make that mistake on your test. I think it's pretty easy to understand this, the Western world and enslavement. It kind of makes sense. And America kept that thing going for a long time, didn't they? And I say they because I want to lie then, even if I am American today. Anyway, folks, hopefully this helped you some to understand the Greco-Roman and Roman world and slavery a little bit better. We'll see a couple video clips on this in class, hopefully here at the beginning of the week, leading up to the test. Until next time, don't forget to be